All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. And welcome to our first Climate in the Media panel. And for those of you just joining us for the first time today, this is the final session of an annual campus event focused on climate and sustainability leadership and action at MIT. It's excellent timing. For those of you who checked your email, there's a big announcement that came out today. So see this as part of that whole movement in terms of MIT's continuing situation and to address climate in the world. So each year we design the final session to be used either for workshop time or to gather input on pending projects or catalyze new conversations. So this year we designed this panel in collaboration with the Environmental Solutions Initiative to really catalyze a new conversation together. And I'm purposely saying to Laur, this is maybe the first, in the hopes that let's see what comes out of this, Deborah, Laur, and friends. You know, hopefully, given that it's 2024, we'll continue the conversation, have a lot to talk about, to say the least. So we crafted today's panel to provide a forum in which to learn, reflect, discover, and dialogue on the complexity of covering climate change in the media through a variety of mediums, and the role of covering climate in, as I just noted, an election year as well. So we've got our work cut out for us, or rather they do. I just gave Barbara at lunch like 16 new assignments. She hasn't written them down yet, but I know she internalized them, I could tell. So we have 4 esteemed colleagues joining us to discuss this today, who you'll meet in a moment. So I'd like to welcome Deborah Blum, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist, columnist and author of 6 books. Her series on ethical issues and primate research for the Sacramento Bee won the 1992 Pulitzer Prize for beat reporting and became the starting point for a series entitled The Monkey Wars. Today, we're fortunate to have her serving here as the director of the Knight Science Journalism program at MIT. And I was also delighted that I think Laur reached out, and like within a very short period of time, Deborah said, count me in. So I think we're really in for a treat. It's been such a fun, great opportunity to finally connect with you and to design, I think, this really dynamic dialogue for today. So Deborah, without further ado, come on up. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an absolute privilege to be here. Thank you, Julie. And I'm excited to be part of this program. As you probably picked up from what Julie said, I've been a science journalist for quite a while. And I was a staff writer for McClatchy newspapers at the Sacramento Bee starting in the mid-'80s and continuing to almost the end of the '90s. That means I actually started writing about climate change more than 30 years ago. And I want to mention that because it turned out that the meteorologists I regularly interviewed, if you were a science reporter in California, you regularly interview meteorologists all the time because storms are either coming in an explosive way or not showing up at all. And the meteorologists that I interviewed back about 1990 were starting to factor human-induced climate change into their predictions. And that was a major light bulb moment for me as a journalist, because I realized while climate change publicly was a very political issue, quietly these bench scientists were accepting it and using it in their work. And that hugely influenced the way I told the story of climate change from that point forward as a fact. And this is something that now we do more and more. In science journalism, we report as if human-induced climate change is a fact. That's an enormous change from the way we did it through much of the late 20th century, in which we followed the political model of two-sidism, right? Or what is sometimes referred to in covering climate change, false balance. And this is something that we see in general in journalism, probably more than in the American public. If you look at the Pew Center's research, you'll see that 55% of American journalists now believe that every story does not have 2 equal sides and should not be told that way. And that's much more than we see in the American public. The American public, in general, about 22% of people will argue that stories should be told from one perspective. In journalism, we're going far the other way because we recognize that it's not a service to anyone if we don't look at where the weight of the evidence lies and report from that position. And that's certainly what we're doing in climate change. Now, I want to to go a little bit farther into some of these details, while a majority of the American public today recognize climate change as a serious policy, obviously that breaks down on partisan lines. 78% of Democrats see it that way, 23% of Republicans. The number of Republicans who see climate change as a serious issue, again, this is Pew Research, has not changed in the last decade. So that says that while we may be telling the story of human-influenced climate change as a fact across the media, we're not exactly penetrating everywhere we want to go. There's an enormous challenge there. And one of the things we want to do is say, a certain segment of the American population either doesn't listen to us or doesn't want to hear this, or take any action in response to climate change. And again, if you look at some of these statistics, only about 13% of Republicans believe we actually should take any serious policy steps on climate change. This then is the challenge to science communication. To those of us telling the story of climate change, how do we reach resistant audiences? How do we gain their trust, especially at a time when trust in the media is not particularly high? If you follow, I happen to love this particular measure, but if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, it will tell you that the media ranks below big business in trust, and we're at about 42% trust level globally. The big exception to this is local journalism, be it digital, audio, or print. People know their local journalists and they trust them more than any other journalist. According to a survey by the Knight Foundation, the Knight Foundation is the original funder of my program here at MIT back in the 1980s. But according to a survey by the Knight Foundation, 6 in 10 Americans say they have more trust in local news than they have in national news. And 78% say that it's local news stories that inspire them to engage with their communities. And this is one of the reasons why there's so much concern now about the collapse of the local journalism ecosystem. The Knight Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation, you may be aware, have just put together a fund of $500 million to try to infuse economic support into local journalism because of such concerns. And I want to take a moment to shout out the way MIT's sustainability program and the Environmental Solutions Initiative are doing very smart, very innovative work supporting and encouraging climate change stories at the local level. Take a bow, Laur. It's really remarkable work. And I want to shout out the local journalists who, working despite the economic problems I mentioned, continue to tell these stories. This panel then looks at the critical role and work of local science journalists, and in that context, and given my point that this promises to be exceptionally influential work, it's worth our asking some questions. Is it working? Do we see changes in behavior resulting from this coverage? And, of course, should we look for advocacy, even Save the World advocacy from journalists covering environmental stories in our time? We've got 3 very smart people here to answer those questions. And we're first going to show you a brief video reel highlighting some of their work, and then I'm going to introduce them and ask them to come up.
Bob Moody lives in a ramshackle split level in the tiny northern Maine town of Castle Hill, not far from the Canadian border. He built this house in the 1980s. The materials were salvaged from a nearby former Air Force base.
And I'm pretty sure that door's not even very efficient. That door's from a 1957 house.
Moody was showing around a team of energy auditors from his county's community action agency in late March. That's his oil furnace running in the background. Moody is among the 60% of Mainers who heat their homes with oil.
You know, I turn this fan on.
Weatherization specialist BJ Esty did what's called a blower door test. Depressurizing the house to see where it was letting cold air in and warm air out. Leaks around window frames and through hidden cracks in the drywall add up.
He has about roughly a 1 by 2 foot square hole that's wide open and all. The equivalent of having a window in your end.
Imagine you're standing outside on a clear day, looking up toward the sun. It is blindingly bright, and it feels warm on your face. What you're experiencing is actually a few different kinds of radiation coming from the sun. There's visible light, which is what we see, and infrared, which we feel as heat. There's also a dash of ultraviolet light thrown in, which is what causes sunburn. Now, imagine the sun has gone down. You can't feel that nice warmth on your face anymore, but you're not in the frozen void of space either. You are, in fact, still feeling that nice, warm infrared radiation. How?
So we think about solar energy coming to the Earth. It comes to the Earth mostly in the ultraviolet and the visible range. It loses a little bit of energy, and it's re-radiated to outer space as infrared.
Essentially, the land, oceans, trees, everything on Earth absorbs visible and UV light from the sun and converts it into warm infrared radiation.
We're going to follow a little mulch path down this way.
In some ways, the 1 acre solar farm at the Arnold Arboretum looks pretty typical. There are rows of steel posts holding blue solar panels up to the sky. But inside a gate, underneath those panels, there's a jungle of wildflowers. Oh my God, it's so tall. It's like almost up to my chin. Look at all the bees. Oh my goodness. There's so many bees.
We can walk around and look at it, but
Yeah.
there's easier bumblebee access.
Arnold Arboretum horticulturalist Brendan Keegan points out why the bees are here. Local plants and flowers like milkweed, foxglove, lupin.
And this is wild bergamot, or bee balm. Bee balm is another common name for it. And they're really loved by all sorts of pollinators.
It is just a buzzing hum of insects going nuts.
Ned Friedman is the director of the Arnold Arboretum. He says when they decided to build a new solar array, they wanted more than just green energy. They wanted an ecosystem. Most solar farms have gravel or grass underneath.
What I would call a monoculture, the antithesis of biodiversity. And so we saw this as an opportunity to change a monoculture of grass into something that supports the ecosystems of an urban environment.
So with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists, Laur Hesse-Fischer, Program Director for the Environmental Solutions Initiative, who leads the program's work in public engagement on climate change and hosts its podcast. Today, I learned climate change. Barbara Moran, climate change and environment reporter at WBUR, also a documentary filmmaker, a book author, and probably most important of all, a former Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. And Annie Ropeik, an independent climate change reporter based in Maine, a former ESI Fellow, and a board member of the National Society of Environmental Journalists. And I'm going to start by asking each of you this question. The former New York Times environmental journalist Andy Refkin has described climate change as a slow drip story, as opposed to the dramatic event-driven nature of journalism. How then do you find your drips? How do you pick a story? Give an example that might engage what I'm going to call a topic-weary audience. And tell us how you found it. Laur.
Let me start.
Sure.
So I took a few, so thank you so much, Deborah, and thanks everybody for being here. It's such an exciting conversation, and I'm happy to see you all. I wear a few different hats. One of the hats that I wear is I host Today I Learned Climate, which is a podcast. And actually our lead writer for that, Aaron Kroll, is just sitting over there. So hi, Aaron. And then I also run the Environmental Solutions Journalism Fellowship, and we take different approaches with each one. Because the key thing is, well, who's the audience you're trying to reach, and what kind of message do you want to share with them, and what do you want them to do with that kind of message? And depending on who the audience is, you're going to change your approach. So with Today I Learned Climate podcast, the approach that we take is, we know people are curious about climate change, either because they recently are entering a climate change career, or they've kind of been in environment and climate but want to know about other things, so they have questions. So what we do is we answer people's questions about climate change. In fact, a lot of what we do is we try to understand what kinds of questions do people have. We have people submit questions to us, and then we answer them in language that they can understand and not along partisan lines. So no matter what your political identity is, you can find a way, an answer to this question that aligns with you and you can support and share with people in your life. With the Environmental Solutions Journalism Fellowship, it's a totally different story because there are, as you were sharing, people around the country who are not getting climate journalism, and they're certainly not getting local climate journalism. So we supported fellows, and Annie was one of our fellows, so I won't steal her thunder on this. We support fellows as they do projects over the course of 4 months that tie climate change science and solutions to what their community already cares about, is already thinking about. And so by giving them the space, the time, a little bit of funding in order to do that, they can make those really deep and interesting connections and have local messengers tell some of those stories. And Annie, I'm hoping you can share a little bit about your project.
Yeah, you go next.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So, as Deb mentioned, I was in the ESI Journalism Fellows class last spring, and I reported a project, as you heard, about Maine's reliance on heating oil. We're the most heating oil dependent state in the country. Heating oil is one of the most carbon intensive forms of fuel. We have a lot of older homes. They're very inefficient, as all of you in Massachusetts also understand. And Massachusetts, frankly, is also quite reliant on heating oil. It just is a higher proportion in Maine. So we have that nice superlative that I can use to kind of with people, which doesn't hurt. But really, this is, it's an example of taking something in people's lives that they already knew about, kind of on some level, may have even had some consciousness of what a fossil fuel is and what that has to do with climate change, or had personal experiences with changing weather patterns that we're already seeing in northern New England. And it's just about helping them connect those dots and then understand, okay, now what do I do with that information? I think that's where people get really fatigued, is if you really beat them over the head with the problem and you don't give them any path forward. And my thinking about solutions journalism as a concept is not sort of blind hope or optimism, but just to evaluate those possible solutions, their impacts, give people the tools to make those decisions themselves as consumers. And in the energy context, people are making choices about, how do I retrofit my house, or what kind of house do I buy? How do I spend my money on fuel, and how do I make these investments? What happens if I can't afford any of this stuff that you're all talking about in the media every day? What am I supposed to do? And so it's a real privilege to be a local climate reporter, I think, and kind of, inspiring, because you have an opportunity to actually have good answers to some of these questions that I think folks covering climate change at a really, really high level can't always get into those details, and it might feel more like doom and gloom when you're doing that, but we have a chance to really dig into the solutions where people live.
Interesting. It was funny what you said about the drip, climate change coverage being a drip, because I work in the daily newsroom at WBUR, and I don't feel like it's a drip. I feel like it's this constant fire hose in my face, and it's like every day I go to work and it's like this river of news going by, and it's sort of like, there's, this governor announces something, or the mayor announces something, and there's some new initiative, or there's a, giant flood, and you know what I mean? So I feel like we're sort of constantly covering climate related or climate adjacent news. And then sort of my challenge with that is, which ones do we cover? Because we can't do everything because it's a river. And then what from those, which ones do we sort of pick out and take time to look at more? And this pollinator solar story is an example of that. This was born out of a report that came out, I can't remember if it was in the state or Mass Audubon or some kind of combo, about the amount of forests that have been cut down in Massachusetts to put up solar panels. So Massachusetts has done a really good job over the past decade installing solar, but the way they did it, they had this perverse incentive program where it ended up cutting down a ton of forest. And I'm like, well, that sucks, or at least it sounds like it sucks. So what are people doing anything about that? And then there's this, so I talked to a bunch of regulators, and it got into this horrible, weird regulation weediness of, incentive programs. And I'm like, oh God, this is so boring. And what do I do with this? And then they're saying, well, we're trying to do this incentive with pollinator plants under commercial solar gardens or commercial solar arrays. And it's not quite working. And then so that sort of gave me, okay, I'm like, okay, I can do this. I can talk about bees and flowers, and that will hook people enough to get in. And then through that, we can address this issue of, forest versus commercial solar and this sort of tension and what can be done to address that and what's working and what's not. So, and that, it all sounds like kind of like goofy, like, hey, bees, and like all that. But that took me that was like months of work to sort of pull all that together and sort of find the right people and the right places to make that into a story. I don't know if that answered anything. It's just like, wow, that's what I feel like most of the time being a climate
was interesting. So let me get at this a different way. I think a lot of times when we're science journalists, we tend to almost personify our audience, right? Who am I writing to? When I was a newspaper science writer, I grew up in the South. I'm from Louisiana and Georgia. So I had a very specific person that I wrote every science story to, who was an elderly woman wearing pink foam curlers, which was the landscape of my Southern childhood, who had not yet had her coffee and was walking down her driveway, which in my mind was a gravel driveway. So she's half awake, and she's going to come down to the end of the driveway, pick up the paper in this coffeeless fog, and my story, which is about science, has to wake her up and grab her. How do I write to that audience? I'm very specific about it. So, and I'm curious about that for you guys, and particularly Barbara and Annie, you write for different audiences. The WBUR audience is a large New England audience, but it's essentially urban. Maine is less urban. So I'm curious, when you're thinking about who you are telling your stories to, what do they look like?
Yeah, I can take that one first. So the editor, so this happens almost every time I'm in an edit, is they're like, your story is for a mom who's driving her kids to work and she's only half listening and she has Cheerios in her hair. And then they're like, she's not going to listen to your story. And then, so there's always this sense with radio, what is it? People are always doing something else, right? You're cooking or driving or something. So there has to be a sort of level of simplicity and sort of things to grab onto in order to hook the busy listener. And to the other point, we do tend to write for a Boston area metro sort of audience. So we assume that people care about certain things, sea level rise and flooding and, what's going on in the seaport, and that people will know about that and care about it. And our audience usually does. But we also, people in Boston go up to Maine a lot. And, we always run Annie stories too, because people around here care, they feel like New Englanders, and they're very attached to what's going on in Vermont and maple sugar season and fishing and the Cape. And so we sort of think of ourselves as like Boston first, but sort of also embracing what's happening in New England.
Yeah, I also come from a public radio background. I worked at New Hampshire Public Radio for a few years, and then that story you heard from me earlier, I'm a freelancer now, but WBUR ran that as part of my fellowship. And the rest of my project was for a nonprofit outlet in Maine called the Maine Monitor, which is just like an online nonprofit. It has a pretty small readership. It's a pretty new publication. I've been working on a climate newsletter that they do called Climate Monitor for a couple of years now. And the audience has really grown, and it's been really interesting because when I worked in local public radio, we had a really engaged audience. I mean, in New Hampshire, I don't know how this is at BUR, but like people felt really entitled to get in touch, and it was great. I mean, I know I make that sound like a bad thing, but it's amazing to get emails from your audience with actual human input, because they can be so faceless a lot of the time. Like, you're not out interacting with them, especially during the pandemic. I mean, you really lost that connection in a lot of ways, and it's still kind of coming back. And then I moved to Maine, and I'm in a new place, and trying to kind of build this beat anew in a changed kind of climate ecosystem, again, post-pandemic. I've only been there for a few years. And all this is to say that it's really nice to hear directly from readers, and so that's a lot of how I've built my concept of who I'm writing for. But Mainers, I think,
yeah, it's not quite so like reliably climate conscious, but it is very environmentally conscious. And I think you find that all over New England and northern New England. So I really try to tap into that. There's that sort of, Yankee can-do, like, don't tell me how to retrofit my house kind of attitude, which is, makes my job more interesting because people are being creative about their solutions and they're not kind of married to any one idea of how they want to change their behavior. They want you to kind of convince them, and so that's fun. And then I think the distracted audience radio tip is just such a good tool for any journalist to use. Like, you really are competing for people's attention. And so with climate topics and science topics generally, it is really hard with the wonkiness. You have to really simplify things, really translate them. I've had to learn a lot of sort of shorthand little pieces of language that I can just use over and over again while trying not to plagiarize myself to explain basic climate topics, and then just writing what can feel like the same article over and over again. But every time you write it, you hear from a few new people who it really got through to, and that's so gratifying. It happens every time I write one of these home energy upgrade stories about like the IRA and like, did you know that there are these resources available? And I'm thinking like, I can't even give this to my editor. I literally wrote this like 2 weeks ago. There's no way they're gonna let me write the same story again, and it's still useful to people if I could put just a little different spin on it. So that's the work, and just kind of keep writing those same stories in new ways until you see the needle move.
And that's the slow drip of it, right? You keep telling the same story, but in a new way. What if, I'm thinking about this, CASJ gives an award to local science journalism. In the first year we gave it, which was about 5 years ago, it was to the Charleston, South Carolina paper. And the lead science writer there said they write about climate change, but they never actually use the phrase climate change. That's such a resistant audience that if they put climate change in the story, people will quit reading. So they will write about sea level rise, they will write about flooding, they will write about changing temperatures or different plant issues, but they won't say climate change. How do you deal with that kind of resistance ever? And do you get pushback when you write these stories? And that's to all three of you.
No. So we get the opposite, right? Where sometimes, they're like, the news desk is like, can we say that this tornado is from climate change? And I'm like, yeah, no. And our audience is like, they want more climate change coverage, and they like hearing the words climate change. And sometimes I feel like we can't actually, no, not everything is climate change. So yes, we don't have that problem. We do have a weekly meeting with NBR with all of the climate correspondents nationwide. And so I hear from a lot of my colleagues in other parts of the country that is exactly right. And it's like they're on another planet, really. It's like they have to use like different words to talk about things. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I'm really of two minds about this. We had a panel, was it last fall, Laur, with Catherine Hayhoe, who's the chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy, and this was with the ESI fellows, and talked about this, kind of meeting people where they're at, and that this idea of there being no wrong doors to kind of people's journey into engaging with climate change, and that if their path does not include thinking of it in exactly the terms that you maybe want them to use or that scientists want them to use, then that's okay as long as it gets them to some form of like adaptive action or some action that helps them protect their livelihoods as the world changes and be part of a just transition, and all of these things that are just sort of basic things that we can all hope for to live safe, comfortable lives. Like, I don't think of that sort of stance as advocacy for myself as a journalist. I think, we advocate for basic human rights in our work in a lot of ways, and that may be sort of controversial to say in those terms, but this is sort of the lens I see climate journalism through. And so I struggle a lot with whether I should be kind of, what's my role to like make people face it, and in what kind of language, and so I think the principle of show don't tell comes into play a lot. You can make people confront the issue in great detail and in a very clear-eyed way without necessarily saying words that may feel politicized to them. That being said, I do try to say it. Like I won't maybe put it in the first sentence. it depends on the story, but sometimes you kind of back into it, as I kind of did with that heating oil story, because it doesn't have to just be about climate change. It can be about economics or other kinds of social justice causes, this intersectionalism idea that we are privileged to be able to report on as climate reporters. So you can that's the pathway, I think, to provide for people to get into climate change, even if they're a little bit iffy about thinking of themselves as getting into climate change, is, well, but you care about your family's budget, or you care about your community's, economic independence from foreign countries. I mean, you can do it in all different kinds of political ways that help people engage.
Yeah.
I think that's such an important topic. I mean, if you're thinking about being a climate advocate or an activist in some way, you want climate change to be the top of everyone's agenda, right? Or very high up on people's agenda. But the fact is, climate change is not on the top of most Americans' agenda. It just isn't. It is for the people in this room, but if you look at the exit polls or you survey Americans about the top issues in the country, for Democrats, it's not even a top issue, let alone for Republicans, it's not even the top 10 or 11th issue. So if you're really trying to engage new audiences in certain ways, you have to do what you're saying and go to where their interests are. It is unfortunate that some terms are going to turn off people, but hey, liberals, some terms turn off liberals too and shut people out. What would be ideal and even better is if you could interview somebody who's a trusted messenger and get them to say the words climate change or our changing climate or something like that, right? And you start slowly inviting people into the conversation. I don't think that the solution that you mentioned is a long-term solution. At least I hope it's not a long-term solution. It might be the reality of what journalists need to do right now in certain environments, just to invite people into the conversation. What you hope is you can start having people then link what we're talking about, sea level rise, warmer winters, hotter summers. If you can link that then to the terms climate change so that it can be understood in this larger context, that would be helpful. But yeah, it might be a slow burn to do that.
You work with journalists around the country, Laura, in your program. Does it come up in other regions of the country more so than in New England?
Well, yeah, none of our journalists, other than Annie, none of our journalists are in New England. Our journalists are in Montana and Arizona and Louisiana and Wyoming and West Virginia and Kentucky, right? We're targeting places where climate change is underreported or where there's contention around climate change. Our journalists have chosen to use the word climate change 9 times out of 10. That's a personal choice, or a choice of their newsroom. That's not something that we tell them to do or not do. They know their audience and their story and their project better than we possibly could. But what we try and do with our journalists is a lot of them, they're not environmental. They're not on the environment beat. There isn't an environmental beat for a lot of these newsrooms. There's certainly not a climate beat for these newsrooms. So we bring them in, we give them access to MIT education on climate change and resources from MIT on climate, and support them with groups across the center or across the campus, across the entire institute, so they can intelligently and in a practical sense start weaving some of these local pieces with real climate science and solutions. Can I just tell a quick story real quick?
You may.
Just very quickly, one of the stories that I think is particularly compelling is we had a journalist in New Orleans who wrote for the largest newspaper in Louisiana, and his story and his project that he proposed, and then we gave him support to actually do, was to talk about how businesses that supported offshore oil drilling were now looking at how to transition to supporting offshore wind development. Right? Which is owned by European companies mostly, right? But how can we domesticate the supply chain for these new energy technologies that are coming in? So he was having local politicians, local oil business people, and he was interviewing them about wind development, offshore wind development, and the role that Louisianans can play inside of this. Let me tell you, that was an important story. That his 5 edition, it went out during the front page of the Thanksgiving edition, the largest paper in Louisiana, right? So Matt, and he was like, I've never gotten more phone calls from people across the state on this kind of story. It's like, that's the kind of stuff, those are the kinds of connections that we can start making to put climate on the agenda. So then it's less like, here's climate science and why it should matter for you, and more like what you're doing is, here's the stuff that you care about and how what we're talking about, this clean energy transition, with this abstract concept, directly applies to your community, your neighborhood, your city, your industries.
And it was a really good series. That Tristan was in the fellowship year before mine, and that was one of the series that made me interested in applying for the program, because it wasn't, I mean, that sounded like a really sophisticated angle that Laura just laid out, but it was also just fundamentally sort of a offshore wind 101 for Louisiana. You know, it's going to be a new industry down there. It's not, I mean, not that it's advanced on the East Coast either, but it's even less advanced in the Gulf, and it's coming, right? And there is a real climate motivation for it to be coming. And so for a local audience who are not quite so much like in the halls of power, or they're not working in these like national level scales all the time, your readership, they're that, you know, second or third tier of the economic impacts of that, and they're going to reap the benefits and potential impacts of that change. And so you're kind of being that conduit for them to engage with things that can feel really big and out of their control, and that can help sow mistrust. And so you're helping to kind of make it real to them in a way that I think helps it feel less scary. And that's part of our role locally. That's really exciting, I think.
I want to raise the issue of diversity in climate change reporting. And I want to start by acknowledging that you're not looking at an incredibly diverse group of journalists here, but this is something that also comes up in my program. The associate director of my program is Black. It took him almost 4 years of pitching to get the National Association of Black Journalists to run a climate change panel. And that ended up being at a meeting in Florida, in which that particular panel looked at the effect of sea rise on Black communities in the South. So he spent a lot of time sort of thinking about, how am I going to interest this group, which is not a group of science journalists, in this issue, because I think this issue really matters. Last month, Pew Research reported that only 40% of Black Americans say the news media actually covers issues that matter to them. So I'd like to argue that climate change should matter to all of us and affects all of us, and that some of the most profound effects of sea level rise and other issues with climate change are often in communities that are not really getting this kind of coverage. And I'm curious as to how each of you have considered the question of diversity and how you approach it in your reporting.
I can speak to this. So as was mentioned, I'm on the board of the Society of Environmental Journalists, which is the largest North American organization for environmental reporters, and many of us are increasingly on the climate beat, though and there's an interesting sort of cultural shift from more traditional conservation science kind of reporter to more of like an energy, climate, political reporter among our ranks, and an age shift there as well, which is really interesting. But so we're having these conversations about what is it to be an environmental reporter, who are we? And it's a predominantly white organization, though we're more diverse than we've ever been. I want to say it might be 25% non-white now. Don't quote me on that, but I think that was the last number I remember. And of course, I'm sitting here, you know, I'm white. I live in the whitest state in the country. The society is more diverse than ever, but we have a really, you know, deep-seated contingent of sort of traditional journalists who see really hardcore reporting on environmental justice issues and how climate change will affect marginalized communities and communities of color more than it will affect white communities. Like, they can see that coverage as advocacy. It's, you know, we're really having this cultural struggle around what journalism and advocacy are, and where environmental justice coverage fits on that spectrum. And these are really, really, really challenging conversations. And even just trying to get more diversity on panels and in topics at our annual conference, which I didn't mean to plug this, but now I'm plugging it. It's going to be in Philadelphia this year. You should all come. It's going to be great. It's really hard. And I guess I'm trying to say all of this because it really matters. You know, we do know that climate change will affect people of color, low-income people, disabled people, especially people in the global South, I mean, to say nothing of in the US, like more than it will affect upper middle class white people. And we have a responsibility to tell that story. And recently one of my SEJ colleagues framed it as if you get pushback on this from colleagues, you can say it's that we're doing it in the name of accuracy, which I loved. Like that we are trying to tell the story, we're trying to represent who the story is really about as accurately and sort of in with as much sort of demographic detail as possible. And that means over accounting for these underrepresented voices. Because the job of a journalist is to tell accurate stories, and so you can just default to that. And I thought that was really smart. It's a struggle though, especially in a really white state. I mean, I have to work really hard to reach out to diverse sources and expand my concepts of what diversity means, but also really strive for racial diversity. And I'm not just covering Maine, so I get to talk to people all over the region and the country for a lot of my energy reporting, but. It challenges you, but it's definitely a worthy challenge. And I'm glad we're having these tough conversations because it's very long overdue, I would say.
Barbara?
I don't have much to add to what Annie said, except that we do try to look at every story we cover or every feature we cover with an environmental justice lens and say, are we accurately reflecting the people who are going to be most affected by whatever, X, Y, or Z, and do we have voices in there from those communities? And not every story has, I'm doing a story about penguins next week. I don't think there's much EJ community stuff in there, but we do take it quite seriously and try to do it with all of our stories.
I think actually, no, you go.
Oh, sorry. And I would say that, I mean, study after study has shown that climate change is more of a concern, I believe, for Black audiences than white audiences, right? And so whenever I don't really get much pushback. Whenever you do get pushback, I'm like, these are the people who are concerned about it that we should be addressing in our audience.
Yeah, I just when you mentioned the penguin issue, I was thinking I was working. I have a part-time job supporting a journalism collaborative that covers the Mississippi River Basin. I'm sort of like an administrative role there, and I was working with a reporter on applying for an award, and the award asked for a little blurb about diversity in your sourcing or the author or the topic, and it was a story about floodplain forest restorations in Wisconsin. It was a very sciencey story. It was a great story, but it really didn't have a lot of diversity in its sourcing, and the topic was of, tangential relevance to diverse issues. So, that one wasn't a slam dunk for being able to write that little statement, but what she did say that I could put, I thought was wise, which was the ecosystem services provided by floodplain forests will help prevent flooding that disproportionately affects communities of color, and in Wisconsin, specifically. And so you can draw that connection. We can always do more to draw those connections more explicitly in our stories, and catching yourself with things like that, I think, is important because then you remember it more next time. But it's certainly better than nothing to even just be aware of the connection, I guess.
Yeah.
I can just say one sentence about this, which is the diversity that I incorporate into all the work we're doing is political diversity. Think a lot about, in terms of the person on my shoulder, I think about the conservatives in my network and how would they respond to this story? And is this something that people who identify as conservative could share among their network and listen to and find themselves in?
Mm-hmm.
That might not be a surprise given the things that I've talked about today. And I just want to acknowledge, I have a part-time appointment with this group called Deploy US, which is about mobilizing conservative right-of-center political leadership. My colleague Denise Bush is over there if other people have questions about Deploy US and how it operates. But talking about people who are affected, who are not engaged in this kind of issue, who we really need for political reasons and other reasons, and of course, that's a key audience that I focus on.
So I've got time for one more of my questions, although I have a really long list, before we open this up. And my question is this: there's a good bit, or there has been criticism of journalists for engaging in what I'm going to call climate catastrophism. a classic example of that might be, if anyone read it, the David Foster Wallace story, The World After Us, right, which pretty much erased us as a result of climate change, and which has been hugely controversial in the very nerdy circles of science journalism that I hang out with. Do you think this is a legitimate criticism? And do you consider climate distress, climate anxiety, the sort of paralyzing effects of some of the way we tell these stories when you're thinking about how to cover climate change? Laur.
Oh man, how much time do we have? I love this topic. There's research that came out that actually,
I saw this.
Did you see this? About like using the term climate emergency and climate crisis and how readers respond to that kind of language. And Aaron and I talk and think about this all the time, especially because of the political perspective that we have on things. And it's not super well received. People really group people who talk that way as alarmists and tend to consider less strongly some of the language or suggestions that they have. So we've kind of feeling that intuitively, we've not used that kind of language. I think there is room for criticism about some of that. We run an Ask MIT Climate series where people submit us questions. I just last night listened to a voicemail from somebody from a Canadian who lives in Florida who said, listen, William Shatner said that we're all gonna die and that our children are not gonna live, and I'm freaking out and my friends are freaking out. Is that true? And so, you know, Aaron wrote a piece recently, we worked with our writers on writing a piece around climate extinction, and is it true? And you know, it's not. I mean, for certain communities, it is an existential crisis, right? For some things that we do, it is an existential crisis. For humanity, it's not an existential. We're not gonna go extinct. So, and I understand this is where the activism comes in. You want to get things on people's agenda. You want people to be thinking about it. You want them to be worried about it. But at least on the political right, it is totally turned off. Huge part of our society who don't agree with some of the solutions that come along with that kind of alarmism. So I understand for certain audiences and certain contexts, that might be the right language to engage people and everything else, but it's not a blanket approach, and I think it can be harmful in certain situations.
Barbara Rani?
Yeah.
I'll hold myself back from saying
No,
more.
I haven't. I go back and forth on this myself all the time, and I do. You know, the person on my shoulder is, you know, a friend of mine who's an engineer, and she is, you know, very well educated, but turns off climate change reporting every time it comes on because she says it's too much doom and gloom. And then I'm like, okay, right, let's talk about solutions, and here's some good stuff, but then I'm like, but nobody's paying attention. And then I'm like, I'm gonna just do more doom. And then maybe people will wake up. And then I'm like, oh, I shouldn't do that. I don't know. So I don't know. I don't know. I don't have an answer. I'm sorry. But I do think about this all the time. I do think about it all the time.
Well, it's important who your audience is and what you're trying to do with them. Like if you're really
Yeah.
trying to get to the people who are turned off by climate change or, you know, the doom and gloom of it, then yeah, you change your story around.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to get people who are, you know, want to hear more about how, you know, how bad it is and put on the agenda, then you might take a different approach.
Yeah.
That's why the audience piece and what you're trying to accomplish is such an important part of this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about doing both. There's a great Brian Greene quote that's coming to mind for me about the best substitute for having the answer being a deep familiarity with the question. I'm really proud of myself that I got to drop my favorite Brian Greene quote while I'm at a panel at MIT, so thanks. But I think that's what you're doing, right? Is, I mean, we can't answer that question because there is a lot of doom in this topic. Like, that's real, you know, and we can't ignore that, but we also know what makes effective climate communication, and it is not hammering the doom too much. So we have a conundrum, and so all of your stories have to do a little bit of both. Some of them do more one or the other. I think of these things in terms of a lot of frameworks that have just helped me kind of make sense of this giant problem over the years, and one of them is splitting climate change into its causes, its impacts, and our responses to it. It was the Vermont state climatologist who taught us that at a training I went to a few years ago, and she said, you know, media focuses a lot on the impacts, and you don't do so much of the other two. And that really changed my approach to this work, and I really tried to make sure all my stories had a little bit of all three. And I really tried to make sure that anytime I was really focusing only on impacts, that I was trying to give some context of like, who's responsible for this? Why is it happening? And
what are you, the mostly non-responsible reader, to do about it? You know, we've had serious weather in northern New England in the past couple of years. Maine has a new disaster declaration for our floods in December. We're probably going to get another one for floods that just happened last month. And we had to write a lot about the climate connections of that, but you also had to help people understand, like, I think at this point we all know, or most of you know, that weather is changing, and you kind of can see that whether you sort of like it or not, and you like the causes or not. So how are you going to adapt? And, you know, I can meet you where you are with that and try to give you some sense of hope, or at least agency. I think that can be a good substitute. And then I also think a lot about, in the doom context, the idea of reframing challenges as opportunities. This is something I got from someone I talked to from my ESI series, about that it's not we have to solve all these problems at once, it's we get to solve all these problems at the same time. And this was in the context of, I think, affordable housing, clean energy, emissions, and like people's, you know, home energy budgets and that kind of thing. And it's, you know, guess what happens if we lose, but also what happens if we win. Like, you can do both of those things at the same time. And holding two things in your mind at the same time is famously challenging for the audience, but we have to try to give them the tools to do it as best we can.
They're terrific, right? So. Time for questions? Yeah, and so I, of course, can take up the entire remaining 20 minutes, but I'm hoping that you guys also have questions, and I know they'd be happy to answer them. There's one over there. Yes. Do we have mics to carry around? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Good communicator.
Thank you. This is fascinating and very informative. So my question to all of you is that, what's the single most difficult question you get on climate change from your audience? You really have to think about and respond to, as opposed to it'll do this or do that.
Difficult in what sense?
Yeah.
Like just hard to answer is, I guess. I mean, that's obviously the definition of difficult, but you know, okay, well, one of the, so our most popular questions on climate.mit.edu that people find on our site is about electric vehicles and wind turbines and if they kill birds. Because people are nervous about some of these solutions, or they want to fact check things that they hear. So that's what I mean by the things that we think we need to educate people on is a little different than the things that they're actually asking for education on. I find that some of the, so Erin and I right now are working on one of the questions we get a lot is how much CO2 does the Earth naturally absorb? Right, because there's a carbon cycle.
Smart audience.
Natural, a little different than maybe the MIT climate. But you know, it's like, oh, how do we talk about this without like redefining what a molecule is? It's like, okay, maybe carbon is like a Lego block, and you know, you think about it getting tied up with other Lego blocks, right? It's like our episodes are 15 minutes long, so it's like we was talking about before. It's like you find these shortcuts, a way of having people kind of get what you're talking about, but without inundating them with science, and they just tune out because they're, you know, driving. They have Cheerios in their hair or whatever. So, so that's my answer to your question.
Barbara?
Well, the most common question people ask me is usually there's been some report about something and it's bad, and people are like, what can I do? You know, what can I do to like slow climate change down? See, this is the kind of thing that makes me like, I don't know. And then I'm like, well, maybe you could eat less red meat, or don't eat red meat 1 day a week. And then they're like, oh yeah, anything else? And then and I'm like, ah!
Yeah.
I don't know. That's my answer.
Yeah.
This is why I can't figure out what to do, because it's like if you're concerned but you're not concerned enough to maybe not eat one hamburger a week, then maybe we need more gloom and doom.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
or more explanation of why not eating beef is like the best thing that you can do.
You see why there needs to be a Society of Environmental Journalists, because like a help group, right? Like a support group.
Yeah,
for
really,
this
for sure.
emotional.
Yeah, we talk a lot about climate anxiety at SEJ. I think one of the hardest things I often run into is like, what's the right answer to a famously impossible to answer nuanced science question? Like, is nuclear energy good or bad? Or
Yeah.
I did a story for my ESI series about wood energy, biomass energy. Is that good or bad? And what does good or bad even mean? And in the climate context, how do you explain that? And like, and it just is, I mean, the answer is always both. Trade-offs, like depends on the context, depends on what it's replacing, but explaining that to people, you know, often in 45 seconds or whatever is really hard. And then I think the doom questions can be really hard to answer. Like my mom's friend asked me recently when I was visiting home, what am I supposed to make of all these things about 2030? Like, what's up with 2030? Is that like, are we all going to die in 2030? Like, why do people keep saying that? And I was like, oh boy, like, how do I explain? Like, yes, like, no, we're not. Here's why people use that as a line, and just like doing that off the top of the dome is almost impossible for me as a layperson. But these are the kind of questions people ask us. And
I second Annie's comment about trade-offs. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Over here and then here, and then.
Thank you so much. I think this is a really important topic. So I'm wondering, I understand with journalism you often focus on individuals, both because, right, you're thinking about who's listening, but also, right, it's a lot easier for me as a listener to feel engaged when I'm like, oh, there's a story about this person. But I'm wondering where structural and systemic approaches to change are, both in how you think about your reporting and the reporting that you do, especially in answer to the question of like, well, what do I do? And to me, the answer is actually pretty simple. Get out there and effing vote. So like, where is that in your coverage, I guess?
I love that question. I think about this a lot, reporting on community scale solutions, and then how communities are talking to each other about not having to reinvent the wheel with every solution that they come up with. So a lot of the stories I've gotten most excited about in energy world is mostly what I cover, but you could probably do this for local adaptation issues too, because so much of that work is going to have to happen at the local level. Like, there's a ton of federal funding. It's going to trickle down to the local level, and then the counties and the towns and the regional government groups are going to have to figure out what to do with it. So that's a lot of what I'm covering, and that feels like the kind of, I don't know, the most relatable pathway to covering something systemic that I can really access, because people don't really pay attention when you say systemic inequality or like
just that word,
the structural, like they don't understand what that means. They can't picture it, you can't illustrate it easily. So you have to find ways to do that feel actionable. And some of these community solutions have been really interesting. Like a bunch of towns in southern Maine just got a grant from the Department of Energy to hire some AmeriCorps fellows to be energy navigators. So they're going to basically be coaches for people to figure out what to do with all these rebates and how to do their heat pumps and stuff. And then it's a pilot program, and then they're gonna try to scale it in other regions. And I thought that was really interesting and smart. It's small, but that's my favorite kind of solution story, is one that provides models for solutions to systemic problems and structural problems. And then my job is to, communicate those to the other stakeholders who could use them. And that feels like the best you can do.
Yeah, I don't usually do ever like sort of, or I'm just going through my like stories I've done. I rarely do like a profile or like a hero story about one person, but we often use like a person to get you into the systemic story. So that's sort of a good, here is a person who's working on X or affected by X. And because if you start with the big systemic thing, then it's too hard. You need that. It helps to have this person as an entry point often. So I think that's how I address that. But most of the stories I do will get at or try to get at a community or larger, question or solution, I think.
Yeah, the vote comment, absolutely. Yeah. And also, I think the point that both they made is so critical is on this community side. It's like the way that we think about it is, it's sure what you can do, but it's like, what can you influence? Everybody has power in different areas. Some people here have power inside of their departments or inside of their offices or part of their church groups or synagogues or whatever it is, inside of your neighborhoods. So how can you use that to start making some change? And that's why we try to incorporate that approach in all of our episodes and in the MIT climate work that we do.
Over here.
Hi, and thank you so much. My name is Vasos Vanvas, and I'm the CEO of Wenverter up in Scotland. I'm an MIT alum, and I came today because I love what you're doing, guys. So I believe that there are two elements that perhaps that you have to help the people to understand. One is the rate of the worsening of the weather that is happening. The rate is the first derivative, as we say here at MIT. And then the other one, which is associated with that, is how much do the distractions cost? So the rate of the bad weather and the cost of the distractions, because they are related. And you can help the people understand, especially the finance community, that they're going to pay a lot of more money down the line. And when the distraction hits their door themselves, then they're going to regret the fact that they haven't financed it before. So I believe that that's going to be some awareness. And I assume that through some research, you can make the audience aware. So the question is that, are you aware of this topic? And how can we make it better for the people to understand? Because if we could finance today these technologies, the technologies are here. We don't have to wait for perhaps other technologies that come down in 10 years or 20 years. The technologies are here. So thank you.
And that's an interesting question. How do you balance the pragmatic costs of change with what people are willing to do when you're telling these stories? Or can you?
I mean, the way that I'm thinking about it is, you said, how can we communicate that to people? But which people, right? If you're talking with people who run insurance companies, it's a very different kind of conversation than someone who owns a shore house or lives by the shore, right? It's a very different kind of conversation for somebody who lives in the mountains and, isn't by the ocean. I mean, you didn't say ocean in particular, but I'm just saying that as an example. One of the things that we find is when we're looking at these numbers are big. When we're talking about the financial impacts of weather destruction, these are big numbers. And it's like, okay, $3 billion. I don't know, like, what's that? Like, what is that to me? It doesn't mean anything, really. So it's like, okay, but if I have to pay an extra $2,000 a year in flood insurance, okay, now we're talking about something that I can care about. So I think as long as you downscale it, and actually this is something that Professor Emeritus Kerry Emanuel has been doing. He's a hurricane expert, very active in climate communications. He works with a flooding nonprofit, or it's a nonprofit that does a lot of different things. One of the things they do is when you're looking at homes, now you can see your flood risk, right? Or sorry, when you're looking to buy a house and you're looking at like a website of it, you can see the flood risk of that home, right? That's gonna, talk about climate communication. That's a great way to talk about how climate change is gonna directly impact people.
Is that flood factor?
Yeah, flood factor.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I think I reported on this recently after Maine had its big floods, and just ran some of those numbers on where the disaster declarations have been in Maine over the past several decades, if they're increasing at all. 2023 is now the first year where we've had 4 disaster declarations in Maine, or 4 events that resulted in federal disaster declarations. And I put it in context of some of the NOAA data for federal data about billion-dollar disasters, which is kind of the metric that they use. And then, I think people in Maine just have experienced it really was a wake-up call. That was what my story was about. A lot of the other reporting, it was sort of this was a big climate moment for us the past couple of months, where people saw it firsthand. They had some data to go with it, but they saw the impacts firsthand. I mean, people died. It was terrifying, like that this could really happen here, you know, and it's going to keep happening. And so I think people are starting to see, and our reporting can help them see that we do have to take action now. And I've been trying to write a lot in my stories about incrementalism and how like any amount of progress you can make now will save you warming in the future. And like you said, we don't have to wait for the perfect solution to take on certain solutions now while we work on the longer term solutions. And so helping people to understand that you just have to start, you know, just do literally anything. And that could be adaptation, it could be mitigation, and that it'll have co-benefits is really important. And putting sort of that human face on those big numbers is increasingly easy, unfortunately, and really important.
And over here, and then I'll come back over here.
Hi, thanks for doing this. My question is about this idea of solutions and the challenges with having the perfect be the enemy of the good. I've been noticing, specifically in the EV category, about a year ago, there's a lot of great stories about EVs. In the last few months, it's doom and gloom. Like, you know, Chicago, these cars are not able to be charged, and you know the mileage. And there was a story, I don't know if it was the Globe or the Times, but it was talking about someone who rented an EV, and they went in rural South Dakota, and of course they ran. So there just seems to be, no pun intended, a flood of negative stories related to this, and how much of this is journalism kind of groupthink, like we got to take this solution and go after it? Or is this, we have to have these perfect solutions? How do we combat that kind of storyline that tends to, now it seems to freak people out about even purchasing EVs or other types of solutions?
I want to say briefly to that there tends to be a kind of corrective with you have the next best thing and everyone jumps on board and they're super excited about EVs. And then you go, wait a minute, did I really look at that in a holistic sense? So for instance, if you look, there's a whole series the Washington Post has been doing on EVs, in which they've looked at some of the environmental downsides with batteries, impacts on communities where these batteries, they've focused a lot on the problems with batteries. And I think that it's not so much an enemy of the perfect or, you know, insisting on the perfect as the natural corrective to the overexcitement that started it. I don't think that that's an unhealthy thing. The trick is figuring out the balance with that, right? I saw that Ford is reducing its production of F-150s, electric F-150s in Georgia, and that's a response to consumer demand as well. So does the journalism drive that, or is it the experience of the consumers? That I actually don't know. Any of you guys?
No, but it's an interesting question, and it's one that we do wrestle with a lot as far as, you know, I'm thinking of our offshore wind coverage, right? And how do you cover this new industry? And, you know, and there's been a lot of pushback against the industry from the right or sort of groups, these sort of groups that are, you know, propped up by the fossil fuel industry, right? And there's some, you know, it's like there's some legitimate questions about offshore wind and effects on the environment and effects on marine life, and how do you sort of take a critical and fair look at something without falling into, you know, talking points being fed to you by the other side. So it's, you know, and then, you know, because journalists like to think of themselves as very, you know, smart and skeptical, and like, you lefties or you righties, you're not pulling one over on us, and we're gonna get the real story. And so, you know, there's always this kind of question of what have we missed, and what are other people not covering, and how do we look at this a new way to make sure that we're not missing something. And I agree with Deb that I do think the EV is a corrective thing at the moment, and then I think it'll balance out over time. Maybe it warms up when it's not winter anymore.
Yeah, no, it's a really smart question. I think you're right that yeah, it is a little reactive, or there's some groupthink there. And we're taught to be skeptical of solutions, and there are a lot of trade-offs associated with things like EVs, and so and offshore wind for that matter. But something I think about is just making sure to emphasize the alternatives and the status quo with just as much scrutiny, if not more, because that was not done historically as much as we are now doing it for these new technologies. That's not to say we shouldn't scrutinize it for new technologies, far from it. I mean, we don't want to be greenwashing, that's really important, but I just always try to make sure to treat doing nothing as having its own cost, and to emphasize just ask the same questions about fossil fuels and legacy technologies as I would about something new, and balance those in my stories.
Here.
Were there other questions over here? Seems like maybe not. Any other questions?
We got one here.
Over here. Okay, sorry.
Is it okay? Perfect. Yeah. Okay, so just because I'm very interested about the conversations about doom versus not doom, and I think there's a bit of an inconsistency, at least from my perspective, because so I come up from an area that is pretty much doom kind of situation. Like I come from a low middle income country, and they're actually the ones completely being thrown in front of like the fire, just being like, survive this. Whereas like, I feel like if we don't, there's a kind of a very big gap between the perception of the serious doom that is happening as a result of like Western and like developed countries, like contributions to climate change and to all these things. I'm just kind of struggling to see how in your journal, like as journalists, how do you balance that doom and responsibility, and then like kind of at the same time accurately reporting the real doom that is taking place due to like the Western / like developed countries' contributions to climate change.
Yeah.
I don't know if that made sense.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. I think about that a lot. I mean, Maine, where I report, is not only is it the whitest state in the country, but all of the oil that we're using is imported. Laur, this is, I was able to report on this through ESI, mostly coming from the Gulf Coast. And where it's being imported, it's mostly coming from Canada, where, you're doing tar sands pipelines through indigenous lands. And on the Gulf Coast, it's places like Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And that's just North America, right? And so something I'm working on is trying to emphasize for Mainers, like, that this isn't just about you. And in fact, in many ways, it's more about these disadvantaged people who are really invisible to you, Black and brown people in other places. So your reliance on these imported fuels is fueling their climate demise, and also just existing pollution problems. And also trying to educate readers in these northern places about the concept of the global South and the concept of countries, where are you from? Okay, yeah. I met a girl from Jakarta at a climate protest in New Hampshire once. She was a student at one of the boarding schools, and it is really jarring to hear those perspectives when you're up here in New England and people are so insulated from it. So just trying to like educate people on those concepts basically, and weave those into your stories, and try not to contribute to that cognitive dissonance or that sort of like blinders that people can get on. But I don't know, it's really challenging. I think there's a lot of really incredible climate journalism being done by publications like Manga Bay and some of these international kind of climate watchdog publications that I find really inspiring and like to try to amplify, but it's tough. It's hard to make the audience connect with it, which is really sad and problematic.
Anything? You're national, or you're?
Yeah, we mostly focus on. Yeah, I'm just, I was just struck, Annie, by what you said about the role of journalism in education, and how through the stories that you've been able to do, and of course yours too, Barbara, is you get to weave in multiple themes, right? So as you're learning about folks in Maine they're knowledgeable about heating oil because they pay for it, and if you read Annie's stories, you'll see they pay a lot for it, and that's a huge problem. And then you can do that, you can use that as a hook to lead people to, well, where is this stuff actually coming from, and what is it doing? And you kind of can unpack these stories, but starting with something that's so relatable and then tracing things back is a really compelling way to try to achieve some of the goals that you're talking about.
And I do want to say, I mean, this is a local journalism, American-focused kind of session, but MIT itself is really involved in looking at climate change reporting in an international sense. Our program just launched a fellowship for journalists only from the Middle East and Africa. We're partnering with Misty on a science journalism workshop that we hope to run in either Abu Dhabi or Dubai in about a year. And that will only be for journalists from the Middle East. So the university itself actually looks at climate change both locally, but let's face it, I mean, we're not talking about this as a local problem, this is a global problem. There's a reason we say global climate change. And so although this topic, just to repeat myself, is more locally focused, I don't want you to think this isn't something that we talk about all the time and try to think about how to do better, because we do. Sure.
And that's why I think American local news is also local news, right? So I think to that extent there is that like globalization point of view. So despite I'm aware that the panel is like mostly to discuss local American stuff, but anything that happens here impacts the rest of the world.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Thank you for
You.
sharing.
And thank you, everyone. We're out of time, basically, but I am always sort of amazed to realize how deeply thoughtful. I think most people don't get a chance to engage with journalists and realize just how much we think about this and how much we care about and how much thought goes into reporting on issues like climate change. So a round of applause for our wonderful panel.